They didn't notice you while it was happening. That's the first thing you need to understand. When you were inside it, carrying weight most people never encounter, navigating pressure that would have broken their sense of direction. There was no audience, no acknowledgement, no one standing nearby to witness what it took just to keep moving. And that wasn't by chance. Hard things don't attract attention while they're being endured. They only get noticed after the fact. When endurance starts looking like strength instead of struggle. At the time, you weren't admired. You were overlooked, misread, sometimes even dismissed. Because people don't recognize endurance when it doesn't perform. They recognize outcomes, and you weren't producing outcomes they could easily label yet. You were producing structure, internal structure. The kind that forms quietly when there's no room for collapse. While others avoided the weight, you adapted to it. While others searched for exits, you learned how to stand still without losing your center. You didn't make it through because you were stronger than everyone else, in obvious ways. You made it through because you stopped expecting the environment to cooperate. You adjusted internally and kept going without asking for permission. That's why most people didn't follow you there, not because they lacked ability, because they lacked tolerance. Tolerance for uncertainty, for delayed reward, for carrying something without immediate explanation. You develop that tolerance in silence. And now that you're on the other side, people are starting to look back and realize something doesn't add up. The version of you standing here doesn't look like someone who should have endured what you did. That's when the questions start forming. Not out of concern, out of confusion, because they wouldn't have made it. And now they're trying to understand how you did. They start replaying the timeline, searching for a moment they missed, some turning point, some intervention, some hidden advantage that explains why you're still standing when others folded. But the deeper they look, the less satisfying their explanations become. There was no rescue, no sudden breakthrough, no external force that carried you through. What they find instead is a long stretch of quiet endurance. Days where nothing improved but you didn't retreat. Decisions where the safer option was available, but you didn't take it. Moments where walking away would have been reasonable, even justified. Yet you stayed, not because you were stubborn, because you had already accepted something most people never do, that no one was coming to make it easier. Once that acceptance settles in, the rules change. You stop negotiating with circumstances. You stop hoping pressure will lift on its own. You stop asking why it's happening and focus on how to remain intact while it does. That's the part they can't relate to. They want a technique, a mindset hack, a formula they can repeat. But there was no formula. There was a decision made early, maybe unconsciously, to carry what was given without dramatizing it. You didn't treat the experience as something that defined you. You treated it as something that passed through you. That distinction matters. Most people merge with hardship and let it reshape their identity. You didn't. You built structure around it and kept moving forward without making noise. That's why when they look back now, they can't pinpoint the moment you endured it. Endurance wasn't a moment. It was a posture you maintained long enough for the storm to wear itself down. That posture is what confuses them now. Because from the outside, it doesn't look dramatic. There are no visible scars they can point to. No stories that resolve cleanly. No symbols that explain why you didn't give way where others did. What they see instead is composure that doesn't match the history they're uncovering. They expect bitterness. They expect urgency. They expect someone who needs to prove something after making it through. But you don't move like that. You're not racing to reclaim lost time. You're not extracting meaning from every interaction. You're not using the past as leverage. That absence unsettles them. Because most people who endure deep pressure come out either hardened or loud about it. You came out calibrated, still, precise. And that precision tells a story they weren't prepared for. It suggests that what you went through didn't hollow you out. It organized you. While others gave way under weight they couldn't name, you learned how to distribute it internally. You didn't carry everything at once. You didn't dramatize the burden. You compartmentalized, adapted, and kept your center intact. That kind of endurance doesn't register as heroism. It registers as quiet normalcy. And quiet normalcy after extreme pressure is something people don't know how to interpret, so they start projecting explanations onto you. Discipline, luck, privilege, anything that lets them avoid the simpler truth. You tolerated what they would have avoided. Intolerance at that level isn't learned in workshops. It's developed in prolonged solitude. The longer they examine your path, the clearer it becomes that what carried you through wasn't intensity. It was consistency. You didn't spike when things improved, or give way when they worsened. You stayed level while the environment fluctuated around you. And once they see that pattern, something shifts in how they look at you. They stop asking what sustained you. They start asking what shaped you. That question changes the tone completely. They're no longer curious in a casual way, they're unsettled. Because shaping implies intention, and intention implies awareness. They begin to realize that you weren't just moving blindly, you were paying attention, not to the chaos around you, but to the limits inside you. You learned exactly how much pressure you could carry without losing clarity. You learned when to move and when to stay still, when to speak, and when silence would preserve more than words ever could. Those lessons didn't come from theory. They came from necessity. And necessity doesn't teach gently. It removes everything unnecessary until only what works remains. That's what they're seeing now when they look at you. Someone who doesn't waste energy. Someone who doesn't chase reassurance. Someone who doesn't tighten when conditions narrow. That steadiness isn't natural. It's earned. Earned through exposure to situations where emotional reaction would have cost too much, where losing composure would have made things worse, where giving way would have ended the path entirely. You adapted by becoming exact. And exactness is uncomfortable for people who live through impulse. They start to sense that you don't need things from them. Not validation, not alignment, not explanation. You operate from internal sufficiency. That's why their attempts to understand you keep failing. They're looking for a story of rescue or redemption, but there isn't one. There's only a long sequence of moments where you chose to remain intact instead of becoming reactive. And once they see that, they realize the truth they've been avoiding. You didn't make it through because you were fortunate. You made it through because you refused to abandon yourself when circumstances gave you every reason to. That refusal is the part they struggle to accept because it invites a comparison they didn't ask for. If you stayed intact under conditions that would have divided them, then the difference isn't circumstance, it's orientation. They begin to see how often you chose the harder internal option instead of the easier external one. How you didn't numb yourself to get through it. You didn't distract yourself into forgetfulness. You didn't outsource responsibility for your state to anyone else. You stayed present, even when awareness was uncomfortable. That's not resilience in the way people usually describe it. It's loyalty. Loyalty to your own center when everything else was unstable. And loyalty like that changes how a person moves forever. It explains why you don't rush now, why you don't react when timelines shift, why you don't respond to pressure the way others expect you to. That night, everyone told you to quit, that you'd already done enough, that stepping away would be reasonable, even justified. You said nothing, just showed up the next morning and kept going. Not because you were stubborn, because you had already decided. No one else determines when you're finished. You've already been shaped by situations that offered no relief. Smaller demands don't register the same way anymore. That's what they're picking up on. Not strength, calibration. And that clarity makes you difficult to influence, difficult to unsettle, difficult to rush. They aren't trying to understand how you endured out of admiration. They're trying to understand because your presence disrupts their assumptions about what unsettles a person and what doesn't. You stand as evidence that most people don't step away because conditions are unbearable. They step away because they detach from themselves under pressure. You didn't. And now that truth follows you quietly into every room. That truth is what lingers long after the questions stop. They don't say it out loud, but they sense it. Whatever you passed through recalibrated your sense of scale. Things that feel overwhelming to others don't register the same way with you. Not because you're detached, but because you've already seen what real weight feels like. And this is what makes their understanding shift from curiosity to something deeper. You've carried silence when noise would have been easier. You've carried responsibility when avoidance was available. And that history lives in your posture, your timing, the way you don't rush to fill space. People sense it before they understand it. That's why their attempts to figure you out never quite land. They're searching for an explanation that fits inside their experience. But your experience exceeds their reference points. You didn't come out of it desperate to be seen. You came out exact. You don't waste energy proving resilience, because you already know what you can withstand. That certainty doesn't announce itself. It settles. And settled people quietly reshape environments built on urgency. They change the pace of conversations. They slow decisions. They make shortcuts feel unreliable, not intentionally, naturally. This is why people keep circling back to the same question when they think about you. How did you make it through without losing yourself? And the answer isn't something they can copy. It isn't something they can download or rehearse. You didn't survive by learning tricks. You survived by staying loyal to your center when stepping away from it would have been easier. And that loyalty becomes visible long after the pressure is gone. It becomes the quiet steadiness people respond to without knowing why. And that's where their understanding finally stops reaching forward and starts turning inward. They realize the question was never really about you. It was about themselves, about what they would have done in your place, about the moments they chose relief over integrity, distraction over presence, escape over endurance. Your survival invites that reflection without saying a word. You don't accuse them. You don't lecture. You don't even explain. You simply exist as proof that something else was possible under the same weight. That's why they keep trying to understand how you made it through. Not because they want your method, but because your existence unsettles the narrative they tell themselves about limits. You didn't overcome by becoming harder. You didn't endure by numbing yourself. You stayed intact by refusing to trade your center for comfort. And once people sense that, they stop trying to decode you. They start respecting the separation between their choices and what you carried without breaking. That separation doesn't close with admiration. It closes with honesty, or it doesn't close at all. You made it through what most people don't, and now they're trying to understand how. But the truth is simpler than they want it to be. You didn't step away from yourself when it mattered most, and most people do. And that's the end of the search, whether they admit it or not. Because once someone realizes that endurance didn't come from luck, talent, or external rescue, there's nothing left to dissect. What carried you through wasn't a secret they can borrow. It wasn't a trick they can repeat. It was a line you refused to cross when everything tempted you to. You didn't abandon your center to feel better in the moment. You didn't trade clarity for relief. You didn't step away from yourself just to make the weight lighter. That choice doesn't look remarkable while it's happening. It looks invisible, but it leaves a residue that never fades. People feel it when they're around you, in the way you don't rush agreement, in the way you don't flinch at delay, in the way you remain steady under pressure that would have undone them. They sense that whatever you endured already shaped you beyond what they're willing to face. That's why their curiosity eventually turns quiet, because understanding you would require them to look at the moments they didn't endure, the moments they stepped away from themselves instead of staying present. You don't judge them by existing, but you do reveal something they can't unsee. You made it through what most people don't, because you stayed when stepping away from yourself would have been easier. And now they're trying to understand how, even though deep down they already know the answer. It's just not one they're ready to accept. What remains after all of this isn't admiration or curiosity anymore. It's recalibration. People quietly adjust how they measure difficulty, commitment, and self-betrayal after observing someone who didn't flinch when it mattered most. Your endurance doesn't become a story they retell. It becomes a reference that alters how everything else feels afterward. Excuses sound thinner. Urgency feels louder. Shortcuts feel exposed. Not because you point anything out, but because your presence carries the memory of weight that didn't undo you. That memory sits beneath language. It shapes instinct. From that point forward, people stop asking what happened to you and start sensing what didn't happen. You didn't fragment. You didn't outsource your center. You didn't dissolve under pressure to make the moment easier. That continuity is the only explanation that survives scrutiny, and it doesn't invite imitation. It invites honesty. Some people feel it and step back. Others feel it and grow quieter. A few feel it and align, but no one mistakes you for fragile again. The understanding settles without ceremony because it doesn't need reinforcement. You're no longer assessed by circumstances or outcomes. You're understood through continuity, through the way you remain intact regardless of conditions. That's the settled state. You made it through what most people don't. Not by becoming someone else, not by escaping, but by staying when staying was costly. And once that truth is recognized deeply enough, there's nothing left to analyze. The questions end. The comparison stops. The conclusion holds. Hello, my dear mastermind. They never saw it coming. You didn't announce the decision. You didn't dramatize it. You didn't gather witnesses or demand applause. You made it quietly, almost invisibly. The way real shifts always begin. And that's what unsettled them later. Because while they were watching for movement on the surface, you adjusted the foundation underneath. No speeches, no confrontations, no public declaration of conflict. Just one internal alignment that changed how you would move from that moment forward. They didn't feel the impact immediately. At first, everything looked the same. Same titles, same desks, same noise, same routines. But beneath that surface, pressure began relocating. Influence started rerouting. Authority began slipping from places that had held it for years without question. You hadn't challenged the structure head-on. You had removed your consent from a position inside it. And systems fail fastest, not when attacked, but when participation quietly expires. They kept talking over each other, unaware the axis had already shifted. They kept enforcing rules that no longer had the same gravity. They kept flexing ranks that suddenly felt lighter than before, all because you changed how you would no longer respond. They assumed hierarchy was maintained through force. You proved it survives only through agreement. And once your agreement withdrew, the architecture began to breathe differently. Eyes started recalculating. Tones started adjusting. People who once commanded rooms felt something unnameable slide out from under their certainty. They couldn't locate the origin of the destabilization because it didn't come from rebellion. It came from reorientation. You didn't rise by stepping on anyone. You rose by stepping out of alignment with a system that had been feeding on your attention. And the moment you stopped feeding it, it began consuming itself. That's why they say the hierarchy rearranged itself. Because no one saw you push a single piece. They only saw the board change shape. And the most dangerous kind of change is the kind nobody notices until it has already rewritten what power means inside the room. At first they blamed coincidence, timing, market shifts, policy changes. Anything that allowed them to believe the rearrangement was external and temporary. Because the alternative was more unsettling. The idea that one quiet internal decision could ripple outward and reorder the flow of authority without ever asking permission. They began to notice subtle failures in places that once felt untouchable. The confident started hesitating before speaking. The unquestioned started over-explaining. The loudest voices began compensating for a loss they couldn't publicly name. You hadn't challenged their rank. You had made it irrelevant to your movement. And when one person steps out of the loop that validates a hierarchy, the hierarchy starts consuming its own weight to stay standing. You watched it happen without interference. A slow erosion of certainty, a gradual redistribution of pressure. Leaders became managers. Managers became messengers. Messengers became noise. And the ones who once depended on your attention to feel powerful began searching for it in crowded places that no longer satisfied them. They didn't lose power because you took it. They lost power because you stopped lending it. That's the truth systems never prepare for. They teach people to defend against opposition, but they never train them for withdrawal. They can survive rebellion. They cannot survive indifference. The moment you stopped reacting to their incentives, the mechanisms that once controlled your behavior began failing. Rewards felt empty. Warnings felt theatrical. Delays felt irrelevant. And because you moved without friction, the friction had nowhere else to go but inward. That's when they started turning on each other. Not in open conflict, but in subtle replacements of trust. Promotions stalled, trust thinned, alliances grew brittle. The structure didn't fall apart violently. It rearranged itself nervously, trying to compensate for the missing anchor it never realized had been you. And through it all, you remained quiet. Not passive, quiet, in the way a foundation is quiet, while buildings shift above it, quiet in the way a pivot is quiet, while direction transforms. They thought power was held by who stood at the top. You demonstrated that power actually flows through whoever is no longer emotionally governed by the ladder at all. That's when the observation phase turned into unease. They started watching you differently, not with the casual awareness people give to equals, but with the kind of attention reserved for anomalies. The kind that tries to measure what can't be measured yet. They noticed how you moved without urgency, how you no longer adjusted your tone to match the temperature of the room, how you didn't chase outcomes the way they still did. You weren't outpacing them with speed. You were outlasting them with composure, and that confused their entire framework. They were trained to respect aggression, not calm. They were trained to respond to pressure, not absence. Your silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled. Every time they expected a reaction and got nothing instead. It unsettled them more than any confrontation could have, because reaction confirms power. Non-reaction exposes it. They started to misread you at first. Some thought you were disengaging. Some thought you were losing interest. Some thought you were retreating. But the environment kept contradicting their conclusions. Opportunities began bending toward you without invitation. People started adjusting decisions around your trajectory before you ever asked. Your name surfaced in rooms you hadn't entered yet, attached to influence that no longer needed proximity to work. That's when the unease sharpened into awareness. You weren't stepping back. You had shifted leverage to a layer they couldn't interfere with. They could challenge a move. They couldn't challenge a position that no longer required permission. You had exited the emotional economy of the hierarchy, no longer trading reaction for recognition, no longer trading loyalty for placement, no longer trading energy for validation. And once you stop participating in that exchange, the entire price system of the structure weakens. People start paying too much for too little. They invest harder and gain less. They compete louder and secure nothing. Meanwhile, you move quietly and receive alignment. That asymmetry is what begins to trouble them. Not because you dominate them openly, but because you no longer need to. They feel it in the way your choices land without resistance. They feel it in the way obstacles soften instead of resist. They feel it in the way momentum keeps finding you even when you're not chasing it. And slowly the realization forms. The hierarchy didn't rearrange itself because you climbed it. It rearranged because you outgrew the need to be shaped by it at all. Once that realization settled in, the behavior around you changed. Subtly at first, conversations paused when you entered, not in fear, in recalibration. The room would unconsciously rewrite its tone around your presence. People who once spoke over you started choosing their words with more care, not because you demanded it, because something about your stillness made noise feel inefficient. You weren't performing authority. You were carrying inevitability. That's a different frequency altogether. Authority can be questioned. Inevitability is only delayed. They began testing invisible boundaries, small provocations, casual challenges disguised as jokes, side comments framed as curiosity, all designed to measure whether the shift they felt was real or imagined. You didn't take the lure. You didn't tighten your posture or sharpen your voice. You didn't explain yourself. You didn't defend the change. You let their tests fail under their own weight. And each time that happened, something inside them recalibrated again. They weren't dealing with someone climbing. They were dealing with someone who had already arrived and no longer needed to announce it. That's when the internal concern began, because hierarchies survive on predictability. They need to know who wants what, who is chasing what, who is dependent on what. The moment you stopped advertising your wants, they lost the map. The moment you stopped signaling hunger, they lost leverage. The moment you stopped needing approval, they lost control. They tried to interpret your stillness as strategy, as long-term plotting, as hidden ambition. But the truth disturbed them more than any conspiracy could. You weren't maneuvering for the next rung. You had detached from the ladder entirely. While they were still competing for seats at the table, you were redesigning the room. While they were still calculating optics, you were aligning outcomes. While they were still negotiating positioning, you were selecting timing. That's why the structure started bending. Decisions began orbiting your direction without direct command. Conflicts began resolving in ways that favored your trajectory without your involvement. People began adjusting alliances preemptively, not because you asked, but because the cost of misalignment suddenly felt higher than the cost of loyalty. And you never threatened anyone. You never raised your voice. You never declared dominance. You simply moved with a level of certainty that made resistance feel mathematically inefficient. That's what truly rearranges hierarchies. Not force, not volume, not visibility. Certainty. The kind that doesn't need witnesses to stay real. The kind that doesn't hurry to prove itself. The kind that quietly forces the world to reorganize around its center of gravity. After the structure bent, the reactions split. Some people leaned closer to you, not out of affection, but out of survival instinct. They sensed that certainty had shifted and wanted to be on the right side of it before the pull became undeniable. Others pulled away quietly, pretending they were busy, unbothered, or on a different path. In truth, they felt revealed. Your calm held up a mirror they never asked to face, because when you stop reacting, it forces everyone else to confront the noise inside themselves. They started watching how long you took before you spoke. They listened for the pauses more than the words. They dissected your silence like it was encrypted language. A nod from you carried more weight than a speech from them. A delayed response felt like a verdict. You weren't doing this intentionally. That's the part they couldn't understand. You weren't managing perception. You were simply aligned with your own direction. And alignment is louder than ambition. They began copying fragments of your behavior without understanding the foundation. The slower movements, the quieter confidence, the controlled responses, but without your internal clarity, their imitation failed into performance. It looked similar on the surface, but lacked the core that made it real. That difference unsettled them, because it reminded them that power can't be borrowed, it can only be built. Meanwhile, the hierarchy kept rearranging itself without a formal announcement. Titles stayed the same, But influence quietly switched hands. People who once dominated through noise found their impact shrinking. People who once depended on visibility found their relevance thinning. And you, without campaigning for any of it, became the reference point. They would say your name in rooms you weren't in, not with praise, not with criticism, but with caution. If they move, someone would say, everything shifts. That sentence alone changed how people behaved around you. Some tried to push you into reaction just to feel powerful again. They wanted proof that you were still touchable, still emotionally reachable, still movable by their hands. You didn't give it to them. You let their provocations echo unanswered until the echo embarrassed them. That's when the last illusion faded. The illusion that control comes from pressure. The illusion that dominance comes from confrontation. The illusion that influence is loud. You proved, without announcing it, that the most powerful position in any system is the one that doesn't need permission to exist. The one that doesn't rush. The one that doesn't negotiate its worth. And the more naturally you stayed in that position, the more unnatural it felt to everyone who had built their life on chasing validation from the same structure you had quietly outgrown. What unsettled them most was not that you rose. It was that you rose without abandoning who you were. Most people only know how to climb by becoming sharper, louder, colder, or harsher. They trade their original self for a version they think the system will accept. You didn't. You refined without hardening. You elevated without turning bitter. That broke every internal rule they had memorized. Because now they couldn't dismiss you as harsh. They couldn't label you reckless. They couldn't even call you lucky without sounding small. You became something more formidable than ambition. You became consistent. And consistency outlasts chaos every time. They watched how pressure didn't rush you, how urgency didn't disrupt your clarity, how criticism slid off you without sticking. That's when the whispers changed tone. At first, they said you were playing it safe. Then they said you were calculating. Then they said you were protected. And finally, they said nothing at all. Silence replaced speculation because they realized something. The more they talked, the less control they had over the narrative. The hierarchy had fully rearranged itself by now. Not on paper, not in announcements, but in behavior. Decisions started happening around your presence, not over it. Discussions paused when you entered the room. Disagreements softened when your perspective was introduced. The same people who once overlooked you now waited for your reaction before committing to theirs. Power did not crown you. Power deferred to you. And still, you didn't perform the victory they expected. You didn't celebrate publicly. You didn't gloat privately. You didn't even change your posture. You moved exactly the same way you did before they noticed. That consistency terrified them more than dominance ever could, because it meant your rise wasn't built on them. It was built on something deeper, something internal, something irreversible. They began to understand that the hierarchy didn't rearrange itself because you forced it to. It rearranged itself because it no longer made sense to stay the same once you moved differently. The structure didn't collapse, it recalibrated around you, without your permission, without your command, without your concern. And that's the part they still struggle to process. You didn't enter the game to rule it. You entered aligned, and alignment does what ambition never can. It bends entire systems without breaking your spirit. By the time they fully understood what had happened, The moment had already passed. That's the nature of real shifts. They don't arrive with warnings. They arrive quietly, settle in, and only later does the world realize the floor has moved. You didn't need applause. You didn't need permission. You didn't need witnesses. The quiet decision you made wasn't loud because it didn't have to convince anyone. It only had to align you, and alignment is heavier than force, stronger than control, more permanent than any title they could ever hand out. They now live in the aftermath of a choice you made when nobody was watching, a choice they can't undo, reframe, or compete with, because it wasn't made for them in the first place. You didn't outplay them with noise. You outpositioned them with silence. While they were busy performing, defending, explaining, and reacting, you were simplifying. While they were trying to rise faster, you were choosing where to stand so you wouldn't have to chase it all. And now they feel it, in the way opportunities flow toward you without announcement, in the way resistance dissolves before it forms, in the way people who once doubted you now orbit your direction without understanding why. The hierarchy didn't rearrange itself because you conquered it. It rearranged itself because your presence made the old structure irrelevant. The ladders they climbed lost meaning when you stopped climbing and started choosing. And the hardest truth for them to accept is this: you never tried to defeat them. You simply stopped needing what they were fighting for. That's the kind of power no one teaches, because it can't be handed down. It only arrives when you decide to move from clarity instead of conflict, from intention instead of reaction, from self-respect instead of validation. And once you cross that line, there is no return to the old game. The hierarchy can shuffle its ranks 1,000 times. It will never move you back to where you were, because you didn't rise inside their system. You stepped outside of it. And now everything they thought was fixed has to reorganize itself around a truth they never prepared for. You are no longer competing for space. You are the reference point, and they are adjusting, recalibrating, reorganizing, still trying to understand how one quiet decision became the moment their entire structure blinked, looked around, and realized the person they'd been watching was no longer inside the system at all. You didn't conquer the hierarchy. You made it irrelevant. And that's a power they can never take back. Hello, my dear masterminds. You never changed for them. You just stopped hiding who you really were. And the moment that happened, the entire atmosphere around you shifted, because for a long time, they were comfortable with the version of you that stayed quiet, the version that played small, the version that made everyone else feel safe by never fully stepping into your own power. They didn't mind you when you were shrinking yourself to fit into rooms that were too small for your spirit. They didn't mind you when you softened your edges, lowered your voice, muted your instincts, and acted like you didn't see what was really going on. They mistook your patience for weakness. They mistook your restraint for fear. They mistook your silence for permission. But what they never understood was that you were never hiding because you were unsure. You were hiding because you were waiting. Waiting for timing, waiting for clarity, waiting for the moment when pretending would feel more painful than standing in your truth. And when that moment arrived, you didn't announce it. You didn't ask for understanding. You didn't explain yourself. You just stopped performing. You stopped diluting your thoughts. You stopped negotiating your identity. You stopped bending to expectations that were built for someone you were never meant to be. And that's when everything changed. People started reacting differently. Conversations shifted. Energy shifted. Some people got uncomfortable. Some people got quiet. Some people got defensive. Some people walked away. Because the truth is, the real you doesn't need approval. And that unsettles people who were only comfortable with your limits. You didn't become arrogant. You became aligned. You didn't become cold. You became clear. You didn't become distant. You became selective. And that level of self-honesty disrupts everything it touches. It exposes dynamics that were built on imbalance. It dissolves patterns that depended on your compliance. It rewrites rules that only worked when you stayed unaware of your own worth. The reason they say you changed is because the old version of you was convenient. The real version of you is uncontrollable. And when someone steps into that kind of self-recognition, the world either adjusts or resists. There is no middle ground. You didn't betray who you were. You returned to who you always were before the world told you to be smaller. And that return, that's what they're reacting to. The wildest part is this: the moment you stopped hiding, they finally saw what was there all along. Not a new version of you, but the unfiltered one. And that version didn't just walk into the room, it shifted the entire room's center of gravity. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't demand attention. You didn't try to convince anybody of anything. Your presence alone carried a clarity that made every mask in front of you feel heavier. And that's why they started scrambling. Because people who benefited from your silence call your authenticity a challenge. People who relied on you dimming your light call your confidence changing. People who expected you to shrink call your growth distance. But deep down, they know exactly what happened. You reclaimed your narrative. You reclaimed your tone. You reclaimed your intuition, the one they always underestimated, even when it was the sharpest thing in the room. And when someone stands in that kind of truth, it rearranges the entire social landscape. You'll notice how suddenly the wrong ones fall back. They don't drift, they drop, because the real you doesn't validate their illusions anymore. You'll notice how the right ones lean in, not because you've become someone else, but because you finally became visible to those who are aligned with your real frequency. And somewhere in between those exits and entrances, you'll realize how much energy you wasted protecting identities that were never yours. You were never meant to play small so others could feel big. You were never meant to apologize for traits that were actually your gifts. You were never meant to shrink to match rooms that weren't designed for your spirit. That's why your evolution looks like rebellion to people who were attached to your limits. And that's why your honesty looks like disruption to people who relied on your silence. What they call you changing is just you waking up. What they call you acting different is just you reclaiming pieces of yourself they weren't supposed to hold. They didn't lose you. They lost access to the version of you that was never sustainable. And that loss feels like chaos to them, because the real you doesn't orbit their expectations anymore. They don't get to decide your tone. They don't get to define your worth. They don't get to frame your story. You're writing your own script now, and the pen is finally in the right hands, yours. And now they're sitting with the consequences of finally seeing you clearly. Something that demands isolation, observation, and transformation. And while they were out there, assuming your story was already written, you were learning to hold a pen they didn't think you'd ever pick up. You studied yourself. You confronted your shadows. You broke out of loops they didn't even know you were trapped in. They thought the silence around you meant stagnation. It meant preparation. Every time life pressed you with something heavy, you didn't crumble. You recalibrated. They saw pauses. You were downloading an entirely new system, and now your presence holds a gravity they can't replicate. They don't understand how you became so steady, so certain, so self-defined. But the truth is simple. Certainty grows when you stop betraying your own instincts. Strength arrives when you stop explaining yourself to people who were never trying to understand you. Power unlocks when you stop performing versions of yourself for acceptance. You didn't grow louder, you grew grounded. You didn't get colder, you got precise. You didn't become distant, you became intentional about what deserves access to you. And that level of alignment unsettles people who are comfortable with you being uncertain, because uncertainty is controllable. Alignment isn't. They can't push your buttons the same way anymore, because you moved the control panel inside. They can't predict your reactions, because you're not reacting, you're choosing. They can't corner you with expectations, because you no longer need to be seen a certain way to feel valid. And that's the part they struggle to accept the most. The new you isn't fueled by proving anything. The new you isn't driven by comparison. The new you doesn't need to be right in their eyes because you're finally right within yourself. And when someone reaches that level of self-trust, their entire presence changes. Their posture changes. Their patience changes. Their decisions change. Their silence changes. It's no longer empty, it's charged. It's no longer passive, it's deliberate. It's no longer fear, it's focus. That's why they keep misinterpreting you now. They think you're distant when you're actually centered. They think you're detached when you're actually disciplined. They think you've changed when you've actually stabilized. The version of you they miss was the version that doubted itself. The version you've become is the one that listens to itself. And there is no going back from that. Once you realize your power doesn't need permission, you stop asking. Once you realize your truth doesn't require approval, you stop explaining. Once you realize your presence doesn't need validation, you stop seeking. And that's when the world truly begins to adjust around you. Not because you demanded it, but because alignment always reshapes its surroundings. They keep replaying old versions of you in their minds, trying to figure out where the shift happened, trying to pinpoint the exact moment you changed, as if transformation is a single event instead of a slow burn that happens in private. They don't see the process. The nights you chose discipline over distraction. The moments you swallowed your reactions and sharpened your awareness instead. The internal victories that never made noise. All they see is the result. And results always confuse people who ignored the process. You didn't wake up powerful one day. You trained your mind to stop folding under pressure. You trained your emotions to stop controlling your direction. You trained your focus to stop scattering every time someone doubted you. That's what they're sensing now, the weight of someone who has already faced themselves and survived. The reason your presence feels heavier to them is because it's anchored. You're no longer floating between identities. You're no longer apologizing for your intensity. You're no longer smoothing your edges so others can stay comfortable. And comfort was the only leverage they ever had over you. Once you took that away, once you stopped cushioning your truth, the entire dynamic flipped. Now they're cautious with their words. Now they measure their behavior around you. Now they wonder what you see that you're not saying. They feel observed without being watched. They feel evaluated without being judged. Because your awareness is quiet but direct, you don't need to confront when your clarity already speaks for you. You don't need to dominate when your steadiness already sets the tone. You don't need to announce strength when your boundaries already enforce it. That's why they feel unsettled. They were familiar with the version of you that negotiated with uncertainty. They don't recognize the version of you that doesn't negotiate with misalignment at all. This version walks away without drama. This version chooses silence without fear. This version selects peace without guilt. And that kind of self-command isn't loud. It's undeniable. It shifts rooms. It recalibrates conversations. It forces people to either rise or retreat. There is no comfortable middle anymore. You didn't outgrow people because you thought you were better than them. You outgrew them because you stopped being smaller than yourself. And that difference is everything. They can call it pride. They can call it distance. They can call it change. But you know what it really is. It's the moment you decided that self-respect was no longer optional. And once that decision is made, the world has no choice but to respond accordingly. And now you see it clearly. The way the world rearranges itself when you stop pretending to be less than you are. You feel it in the pauses between conversations. You notice it in the hesitation behind certain smiles. You sense it in the way some people suddenly don't know where they stand with you anymore. That confusion isn't weakness on their part. It's the shock of realizing they no longer control the version of you they once understood. You used to be predictable to them. You used to be readable. You used to be someone they could label quickly and place comfortably inside their expectations. That illusion is gone now. And when illusions dissolve, people scramble quietly before they ever react openly. They're not afraid of you. They're uneasy with what your awakening represents. What your confidence reflects about their hesitation. What your boundaries reveal about their habits. What your growth exposes about their stagnation. You didn't become intimidating. You became self-directed, and self-directed people can't be steered, guilted, pressured, or manipulated the way they once could. That's why the air feels different now. You don't argue the way you used to. You don't explain the way you used to. You don't chase clarity the way you used to. You already have it. And clarity changes everything. It changes how you speak. It changes how you listen. It changes how you wait. It changes how you choose. You don't rush to prove yourself because you're no longer negotiating your value. You don't rush to defend yourself because you've already accepted who you are. And that internal acceptance is louder than any external approval ever could be. They try to test you now in subtle ways, small comments, slight shifts, quiet challenges, to see if the old version still exists somewhere they can reach. But every time they test, they get the same result: composure, discernment, distance, not coldness, control, not arrogance, certainty. And that unsettles them more than confrontation ever would, because confrontation gives them something familiar to push against. Your calm gives them nothing to grab. You've become unhookable, unbotherable, unreadable in the ways that used to make you vulnerable. And in that unreadability, you've found a new kind of freedom. You're no longer reacting to every ripple. You're deciding which waves deserve your attention. You're no longer adjusting your identity to fit rooms that don't deserve your presence. You're selecting your environments with intention. And intention is the difference between drifting through life and commanding your direction. They feel that shift in you, even if they can't name it. They feel the way you're no longer available to dynamics that once drained you. They feel the way you no longer bend to emotional pressure. They feel the way you don't need to be seen to feel solid. And that realization quietly rearranges the hierarchy in every room you enter. And now everything makes sense to you in a way it never did before. The tension you used to feel in certain rooms, the subtle resistance you couldn't explain, the strange pull toward growth that never let you stay comfortable for long. You weren't losing people. You were outgrowing versions of yourself that could no longer carry where your life was headed. That's the truth. They're only now starting to feel. The reason your presence feels different isn't because you're trying to dominate anything. It's because you're no longer hiding the authority you always had over your own direction. You're no longer asking life what you're allowed to become. You're deciding. And decision is the moment power becomes real. They keep calling it change because they need a word that makes your evolution feel temporary. But this isn't a phase. This is alignment. This is what happens when someone finally stops splitting themselves into acceptable pieces for other people's comfort. This is what happens when self-respect outweighs social approval. This is what happens when instinct finally outranks insecurity. You didn't wake up one morning and become someone else. You remembered who you were before the world taught you to hesitate. And that remembrance is irreversible. They sense it now, in the way you don't rush your answers, in the way you don't chase attention, in the way you don't compete for validation. You've stepped into a frequency that doesn't beg to be heard, it just is. And anything that doesn't resonate with it naturally falls out of range. That's why people are reacting without knowing why. That's why dynamics are shifting without discussion. That's why certain doors are closing without argument while new ones open without effort. You didn't force these outcomes. You aligned with yourself, and alignment did the rest. They can say you're different. They can say you changed. They can say you're not the same anymore. And they're right about one thing. You're not the same. You're clearer. You're steadier. You're no longer divided between who you are and who you pretend to be. The old you needed reassurance. The new you carries certainty. The old you hesitated to take space. The new you knows exactly when to step in and when to walk away. And the most important shift, you stopped waiting to be chosen and chose yourself first. That's the shift that rearranges everything. They didn't lose you because you became distant. They lost the version of you that made their comfort easier than your truth. You didn't change for them. You simply stopped hiding for them. And that decision didn't just reveal who you are. It revealed who was never meant to walk with you into this next chapter. And here's the part they don't know how to process yet. The version of you standing here now is only the beginning of what happens when someone finally stops negotiating with their own truth. This chapter you're in isn't the peak, it's the foundation. Everything you stripped away, every illusion you dropped, every mask you retired, that was preparation. The old you survived confusion. The new you moves with direction. The old you asked questions. The new you is the answer. They will keep trying to understand what shifted, when it shifted, how it happened. They will keep studying your tone, your silence, your choices, your stillness. But they won't find a single moment. They'll only find a pattern of discipline, self-honesty, and quiet decisions that added up to something they can't reverse. Because this kind of evolution doesn't announce itself with noise. It announces itself with permanence. You are no longer becoming, you are being. and the energy of being is unstoppable. Rooms will feel smaller to you now. Conversations will feel slower. Excuses will sound louder. Because once your inner world sharpens, everything external becomes more obvious. You'll notice how people reveal themselves without speaking. You'll sense intentions before they're acted on. You'll notice how people reveal themselves without speaking. You'll sense intentions before they're acted on. You'll feel shifts before they happen. Not because you're superior, but because you're aligned. And alignment always looks like awareness to those who are still drifting. They will call you intense, distant, different because they aren't used to someone who means what they say, who restricts access they never earned, who no longer hesitates for their comfort. Let them talk. You didn't come this far to be understood by people who never listened to you when you were still soft. You didn't survive becoming yourself just to dilute it again for comfort. You paid too much to earn this clarity. You walked too far in silence to turn back into noise, and the universe respects that. Opportunity respects that. Life rearranges itself around people who stop lying to themselves. That's why things are opening now without force. That's why paths are aligning without struggle. That's why what once felt heavy is beginning to feel guided. You're not chasing anymore. You're choosing. You're not reacting anymore. You're directing. You're not hiding anymore. You're present. And presence is the rarest form of power. They will remember the old you because it was easier for them. You will honor the new you because it is finally real. And from this point forward, every step you take will feel quieter on the outside and louder in its impact. Because when someone stops hiding who they are, reality has no choice but to respond.